Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Fabian Drixler, Assistant Professor of History at Yale University. Professor Drixler teaches Japanese history. Today we talk with him about his forthcoming book, Infanticide and Fertility in Japan, 1650 to 1950. Welcome, Professor Drixler.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Let's begin talking about your book. Tell us a little bit about it.
So the book is a cultural history of infanticide and a demographic history of fertility change wrapped into one. One way to think about it is that there is this great turning point that I identify in the years around 1800. So in 1750 you have a world where in large parts of Japan people will only try to raise 2 or 3 children, and some of those children will die, so at the end of the day they'll have less than 2 descendants per couple. The way they achieve that is through widespread infanticide mostly. By 1850, infanticide has been questioned, has been combated, has been widely discussed, and people once again now raise 4 or 5 children per couple. By 1920, they raise 6 kids, and infanticide is rapidly becoming something that is more or less unthinkable. So that's the great arc that I'm trying to describe with this book.
And it is it's an interesting topic, and I would imagine somewhat of a difficult one, infanticide. And you've looked at many different aspects of Japan. Why infanticide, for instance? Why write this book?
Infanticide is a great window into people's minds, because the whole practice of it, which has become so unthinkable in our society, depends on the way that people imagine themselves in their universe, and in the way they understand when human life begins, what happens after death, both for the infants you kill and perhaps your ancestors who linger around the family as protective spirits. It relates in more complicated ways to the way you imagine the nature of time, the way you define community. So in that sense, it's a very attractive topic. The other reason, though, why I think it's so important is that demography is a great way to understand the past in many ways. And really a colonization frontier of knowledge. There's shockingly little in many ways we know about the demographic past of our world, and there's been a huge amount of wonderful work over the past 2 or 3 generations. But the things we don't know are just astonishing once you contemplate them.
Okay, and let's talk about your methodology. How did you do your research?
So the research really has 2 major legs. The first leg is the demographic analysis of a large collection of individual level data. So I spent many years going through libraries and archives, tracking down population registers from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century.
And are they readily accessible?
Some of them are. One wonderful thing about Japan is that each municipality has, at some point in the last 50 or 60 years, launched a local history project, whereby they wrote up the history of their town. And even for small villages, these collections can run to 10 magnificent cloth-bound volumes. And in many of those, they collect the documents that are available locally, type them up for you, publish them, and deliver them to the shelves of the Sterling Memorial Library. And this is especially important because the archival system of Japan, for the early modern period anyway, is not especially well developed. And so only a small fraction, maybe 5, maybe 10% of the surviving village level documents from this period can actually be accessed in archives. All the rest is still owned by the descendants of the headmen, for instance, who created these documents in the first place. And so the only efficient way of accessing them without going through a long dance of gaining the trust of these individuals is to find them in these collections. That said, the archival collections have been really useful for my project as well. So something like 1/3 of these population registers are things that I've found in archives. So that's the first leg. The second leg is a wonderful wealth of different types of materials on infanticide. I say wonderful because, well, it's a strange word to use maybe in this context, but as I got deeper and deeper into this project, I was just astonished how many different kinds of materials you can find about infanticide. So there are policy proposals that villagers might send to their lord with ideas of how to combat infanticide. There are pregnancy reports that peasant women had to submit to the authorities to respond to a surveillance policy that tried to stamp out infanticide. But there are more unexpected things too, like poems about stela for murdered silkworms in regions where people kill infants without a second thought, according to the author of the poem, or the dialogue between a louse and the giant bird Pang of the East Asian bestiary, whose wingspan is 1,000 leagues. They talk about infanticide. They talk about nothing but infanticide. And then finally, there is a rich visual record as well. And to track down that record has perhaps been the most adventurous, exciting part of the research process, because a lot of these materials are rather large wooden boards that are painted with an infanticide scene, and the murderous mother then transforms into a she-devil or an animal. So the message being, you commit infanticide, you lose your humanity. And a lot of these have been lost because they weren't considered great works of art, but several dozen remain. And often they're tucked away in some chapel deep in the mountains that might only open on 2 predetermined days in the year for airing out, as they call it. And then the community gathers in the chapel and has a little party.
And so were you able to visit on those days and have access to that information? Or?
Right, with the help of many people I was. And also get a sense of how the descendants of people in these areas who are now in charge of those chapels think about those artifacts and think about the history of infanticide. And one of the most wonderful things was that I found this one local employee of a prefectural museum. And I went there because I knew that they, in their storage, had one infanticide tablet. And he said, oh, why don't you come back in 3 or 4 days? I'll get the museum car, and then I'll drive you to all the places you want to be driven in my prefecture. And so I gave him the list of sites I wanted to visit. He made all the phone calls, he got the car, and I had these delightful 4 days with this very generous man, tracking down these images that in many cases you can't find anywhere in the published record.
Now, in sitting here listening to you, the thought strikes me, particularly when you look at the written registries, were the deaths tracked, or was it just births? So in other words, did they just pretend that the death never happened, and how does that work?
Well, that's a very astute question. There's not a whole lot of direct evidence for infanticide. So we have one diary of a man who mentions that he kills his own children in 3 cases, and a couple of other documents where people admit that they themselves are practicing infanticide. But on the whole, we have the complaints of people who think that infanticide is a problem, or the sort of rather feeble excuses of people who think that it's not a problem. And then we have the patterns of the demographic record. And to respond more directly to your question, the population registers of the Tokugawa period, the sort of heart of the 300 years that I span in my project, only recorded children typically the first time the annual recording ritual coincided with their lives. So if a child was born in December, the first recording might be in March, when the population register was compiled. If the child was born in April, it would also be in March of the next year. And so we can't actually literally track births, with a couple of exceptions, and we don't see these early childhood deaths. So part of my methodology was to back project the population, and there's been a lot of good work that allows us to estimate the sort of unintended infant mortality rates with a lot of confidence. They're right around 15–20%. And so if you find 10 children in the record. This means that you should assume that originally there were 12 or 13 children. I mean, put very crudely. And so, really, the victims of infanticide are these absences that we have to track down in the record. And they're visible in all sorts of patterns that depend on the gender of the child, for example, but also of the timing of the birth. And then just in the implausibly low number of children that people say they've given birth to. And we're talking 2 or 3 children when, under the kind of conditions of life and contraceptive technology and so on that people had at the time, it's hard to imagine that people would have had fewer than 6 or 7 children without the practice of infanticide.
You speak of 3 different cultures of infanticide in Japan. Let's talk a little bit about that.
So I think one good way to visualize those different cultures is to look at 2 encounters that happened in highway inns in Japan in the early 18th century. One of them was between, one of them involved a pilgrim from a part of southern Shikoku who was going to the great shrine of Itsukushima, which I noticed is part of the clip that you play at the beginning of these interviews. It's this little sort of postcard picture of a shrine gate in the water. I guess the one image that represents Japan most directly in this clip. He stays at an inn. All of a sudden, another guest rushes out. There's a big commotion. And he turns to another lodger at the inn and asks, "What's going on? Has somebody discovered that there are robbers among the travelers?" And he says, "No, actually we discovered that there is a man from southern Shikoku among us. And in southern Shikoku, people will kill children without a second thought. And we are on this holy pilgrimage. We can't share a roof with people who do such a thing." And so the man from southern Shikoku is so ashamed that he breaks off his pilgrimage and goes home and vows to do better. So that's, oh, and I should note, in the conversation that unfolds about infanticide in this inn, the pilgrims say, "Well, we are from a part of Japan where such a thing could never happen." Now, when a woman is pregnant from an adulterous affair, she might seek the assistance of an abortionist. But the abortionists are so frowned upon by the population that even little children know that you can't even point at their houses because your fingers will rot off if you do, and we only suffer them to live at the edges of the village and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's encounter number 1. Encounter number 2 happens at the other end of Japan in the east, right around the same time, circa 1720. And you have a medicine peddler from a region of Japan that again is proud to raise every single child. And he stays at this inn in a part of Japan that is sort of a byword for infanticide by this time, the northeast. And he sees that the innkeeper is carrying out the child, a newborn child, into the garden. And he thinks this odd and tags along. When he notices that an infanticide is going to happen, he clings to his sleeves and eventually talks him into accepting a subsidy for buying milk in exchange for raising the child. Now, both of these are stories that are written down much later, and so there are no doubt lots of embellishments. But they were plausible to people, and the reason they were plausible is that you had, broadly speaking, 3 different cultures of infanticide. One is the culture that I dedicate most of my book to. A culture that uses infanticide as the major form of family planning and uses it to an extent that results in depopulation, every generation being smaller than the one that preceded it. There is a second area where infanticide is still evident in the traces of the demographic record, but people don't talk much about it at the time, and it's not frequent enough to be the cause of major depopulation in those areas. And then there's the final third of the archipelago, where people make it part of their identity that they do not commit infanticide, although if you start looking into their population registers, there are lots of funny things going on there too, and it's pretty clear that infanticide was to some extent practiced there. But more importantly, they resorted to different ways of keeping their household size manageable, and a lot of those ways abhorred people who lived in the infanticidal areas. So, for example, they involved selling 6, 7-year-old daughters into prostitution. And so the people in the infanticidal lands would say, you people are just like dogs and cats. How can you just sell your children as though they were animals? We are the true humans. We raise our children well. And sure enough, we have to discard some of our kids to do so. But it's more important to raise the chosen children well than to afflict all children that will come with a life of poverty and hunger and cold and bondage in many cases.
Okay, so is it primarily a geographic difference where these beliefs were different? Would that be true? And then I guess it strikes me as, in terms of what you just said, the chosen child, how were these children chosen? And then the other awful thing is, who would be the one to kill the child?
Lots of great questions.
Yeah.
Let's see how I can do this without launching into a long monologue. The geographical divisions were clearly present in people's minds in the 18th century. You know, 18th century is kind of the heyday of this culture of infanticide. On the ground, things were more complicated, and of course there were disagreements. Some people living in areas where infanticide was very common didn't think it was a good idea, but village communities were fairly tight-knit. And if there was a poor family that raised a 4th or a 5th child, the neighbors would come knocking at the door and ask, what are you doing? What kind of unreasonable behavior is this? You'll drive your household into ruin. You're not doing right by your own children. And by the way, you'll be a welfare case for the rest of the village. So why don't you rethink this pregnancy? And that's a major factor for creating this geographical unity. The other thing is that people's attitudes to a lot of important issues, including life, death, is infanticide acceptable, really depend on whom they interact with. And especially in an 18th century society, interactions are very much spatially bound. So the number of people you know who think that infanticide is a good idea will depend very much on where you live. And so that's a real factor for this geographic pattern that we see. On the other hand, there are these disagreements, and they really open up in the 19th century, when especially local elites and sort of the warrior governments that ultimately administer the villages begin to think that infanticide is a huge political, social, economic problem. And then it's a question, how do these sort of pioneers of the new view of infant life being sacred convey that to the, in their view, benighted parts of the population? You also asked how people selected.
Right. Does it matter if it was a boy or a girl? I mean, did it, maybe the number mattered? You know, they went even, odd, you know, I have no idea. And then who was the one to take care of that terrible task? And how?
So infanticide is quite common in the ethnographic and historical record, once you care to look. And a lot of people know that in places like China or India, it really tended to target women, or that's at least the impression you get from reading the documents, the contemporary accounts. In Japan, it was more complicated. If you were a girl, you were at a slightly higher risk of falling victim to your parents' unwillingness to raise you. But one very typical pattern that we see very, very strongly in the demographic record is that your chances of being accepted by your parents depend on how many children of the same gender already exist in the household. So if you're a girl and you're born into a family with 2 sons, chances are that your parents like the idea of having this kind of balance. If you're a girl born into a family with 2 daughters, they probably don't need a 3rd daughter, and that will be it for you. Similarly, if you're a son and you're the 3rd or the 4th son and there's no daughter in the household, the parents might think, oh, we'd actually quite like our 3rd child to be a daughter, so let's send this child back, as the phrase went, and another one will come in a year or 2 or 3.
And who took care of sending the child back, typically?
that's actually a surprisingly difficult question. So we have all these accounts and images, and almost invariably it's women who do the killing.
Wow,
but
that is shocking to me. I would have said it was the father or a third party.
Now it's interesting to think about why it is shocking to us, and I think part of that is that we live in a world where maternal love and immediate maternal love is taken for granted. But one thing that this world that I've spent a lot of time thinking about suggests is that maybe this is not as natural as we might think, and much more culturally bound. And again, if you look around the world, infanticide is so commonly practiced in many societies. Well, not anymore, but
And actually, I was down the road. I will get to asking you at what point did it become completely unacceptable?
Well, maybe I should launch right into that.
Yes, we'll finish up with the questions of
who was responsible.
Who was responsible. And
so one thing that made it more likely that women would do the killing, or I should say, one thing that makes it more plausible that it really was women, is that men did not lightly enter the birthing space. Childbirth was considered something that was polluting, with all the blood being spilled. And so, quite often it would happen, even in poor families, in a part of the house that would be screened off, sort of a separate space, and again, men wouldn't usually enter that. And even in the early 20th century, a large proportion of Japanese women give birth unaided. They just squat down by themselves and deliver the child by themselves.
Wow.
Maybe their mother-in-law will be around, maybe a friend, but often not even that. I think that's also really difficult to imagine, right, from our current society. So there is a certain ferocious strength to these women that is in some ways, I think, alien to what we assume to be natural. But of course, when you start analyzing these accounts, there's this intriguing gender dimension to it. Men trying to change the behavior of women, or denigrating women, painting women as being transmogrified into demons, into animals. And so, to some extent, these accounts of women doing the killing might be slightly problematic, and I don't have an ultimate answer to that. In terms of who made the decision, it seems that usually it was consensual within the family. In some cases, there would have been conflicts about it, and we have accounts of one of the rare cases where a husband kills the child, and the wife said, "No, this was a misunderstanding. I actually wanted to raise the child," and vice versa. But typically, the grandparents would have a role, and both parents.
In going through the material that you sent me, it looks like literally millions of babies were killed during this 300-year span. I imagine more in the earlier period than moving toward the 1950s. And from what you've said today, it's primarily a survival mechanism or economic, where either the village or the family would suffer if these children were not killed. So that gets me to the point where, at what point did it become unacceptable, and why did that happen?
I should say first that suffering is very relative. And infanticide has been studied for a long time by historians, something like 90 years. And for the first couple of decades, the sort of standard view was that infanticide was proof that life was really very bad for the people of the 18th century, and that they were always at the brink of starvation, and so on and so forth. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but if you look at who, in a sort of social stratification sense, practiced infanticide, there are periods when the rich seem to do it a little bit more than the poor, and generally it's very even. So, if you're a rich person, suffering means that you can't throw a big party for the 7th birthday of your child, that sort of thing, right? You can't send presents to everybody in the village as you're supposed to.
I see.
You can't buy a nice new dress for your daughter. You can't send your son to school if you have 7 of them. But even for the poor, it wasn't usually a question of death or survival. There was this idea of what an appropriate way of raising a child would be. And that appropriate way of raising a child depended on your economic station. And so the fertility norm worked out in a way that everybody was supposed to raise 2 or 3 children and raise them as well as they possibly could. You can look beyond the economics of why people committed infanticide, and there were various ideas that made infanticide seem virtuous. Again, a very bizarre notion to us. One of those was that, well, I've mentioned several times already, you have to do right by the children you choose to raise. So to be a good parent, you commit infanticide, paradoxically. Another paradox is that people who cared a lot about their posterity, about their descendants, were encouraged to commit infanticide. What mattered was the survival of the household, not the question how many descendants you have, but that this is one prosperous household that keeps perpetuating itself in time and sticks around to venerate its ancestors. And the best way to ensure the prosperity of the household is to make sure that property doesn't have to be divided between 6 sons, right? Or even the expenses of raising the children detract from the strength of the household in the future. And so this idea of how the afterlife works becomes entangled in the practice of infanticide. And it means that practicing infanticide is a boon for your descendants, but also for your ancestors, who can then enjoy the continued veneration of the household and remain in their sort of pleasant, serene state of ancestral deities. Because once the household vanishes, those ancestors have to go back to the cycle of rebirth and suffering that is a big part of the Buddhist worldview. So it is really, and one reason this book is getting very long is that this is a very complex culture that has its own logic that I find takes a while to wrap one's mind around. Maybe one important piece of the puzzle, though, that I haven't mentioned yet is why there aren't big barriers to committing infanticide. Right? It's one thing to have a reason to want fewer children. That was true for people in many places and times. But it's another thing to actually take the step and kill the child. And so a real key issue is whether you think that under any circumstances a child can be killed. And the reason people who otherwise thought of themselves as good and kind in the 18th century, say, would commit infanticide was that a newborn child, was not considered a fully formed human being.
I see.
And one way we can understand that maybe is to think about people who, well, at least in the liberal parts, well, let's say the pro-choice parts of America, have abortions. They don't think of themselves as worse parents. The reason they can have abortions is that they don't think of a fetus in the first trimester as a fully formed human being. And where we draw that line between something that isn't quite a human being yet and a member of human society who deserves the full protections that membership affords is arbitrary. You can say it's convenient to draw it at birth because that's an impressive event with lots of noise and blood and so on. But a lot of societies actually drew it a couple of minutes after birth, at the point when parents made the decision whether they wanted to keep the child or to discard the child. And this is very much the story of this culture of infanticide in Japan that I study.
Getting back to one of the questions I had asked previously, so you had said the mother will pretty much kill the child after giving birth. Is there a special ritual that one would do as part of this, or?
That's a really interesting question. If anything, the absence of ritual in some ways is striking. So it's the ritual that turns the child into a member of the household, into a member of the human community, and that ritual would be a bath typically, or being wrapped in a rag, kind of thing. There were different ways of committing infanticide, and some of them involved things that seem strangely elaborate, like taking a soaked piece of paper and putting it on the face of the child to suffocate the child. So maybe you can think of that as a ritual and say, well, why do they go to the trouble of soaking a piece of paper? Maybe it's the idea that the child shouldn't even draw a breath, to ensure that the child hasn't crossed this threshold to full human life. I should also note that this attitude to children occurs in a society that, on the whole, is really worried about killing other beings. It's a society that puts up stone monuments to silkworms that are killed in sericulture, monuments to grasshoppers that have to be killed by pesticides so that they don't devastate the crop. It's a society that has elaborate burial rituals for whales that are beached or hunted down. So the real story seems to be that children are liminal at the point of birth anyway, and they can return to kind of an ill-defined spirit world without a great deal of pain, and in a way that isn't really a death. And because it's not really a death, killing the child isn't really taking a life. And people come up with euphemisms that, like sending back the child or weeding out superfluous plants that make it, I think, psychologically easier for them to commit infanticide, because there's no doubt that it's still unpleasant for people.
Sure.
Right? Nobody likes doing this, but you need a lot of sort of cultural justifications for committing infanticide, and a lot of incentives for doing it as well.
Okay, and your book goes to 1950. Were there still infanticides taking place at that time? And did you study the period, after that? When did it officially end, or was outlawed, or is it outlawed at this point? I assume it is.
Oh yes, very much so.
Yes.
So the situation of infanticide in Japan today is the same as in the United States, really. It happens rarely. When it happens, people are shocked. About, let's see, 30 or 40 years ago, there was a series of babies abandoned in coin lockers, and people found that very shocking and thought it said something profound and disturbing about the state of their society. Which in itself is interesting, because some of the people who lived in a world where infanticide was something to be encouraged were still alive at this time, so it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the social change. The single most surprising discovery for me in this project actually was that infanticide still occurred on a huge scale in the early 20th century. When I submitted my dissertation, the first version of this project, I thought I had it all figured out, and the arc was that by the 1880s, which is the time when people stopped talking about infanticide, it also went away as a phenomenon. There's a break in the demographic record right after 1870, and so we can't perform the kind of analyses that the early material allows in the modern period, which is rather ironic. But the modern period has another type of data that in some ways is just as valuable, and those are statistics about stillbirths. And stillbirths are fairly consistent in different societies when you look at all the statistics that have been collected in 19th century Europe and 20th century developing world and so on. And it's very rare for a stillbirth rate to go over 4%. In Japan, there are districts where it was more than 40%, meaning almost...
They were calling the... they're just using a different word for the infanticide being stillbirth.
Exactly,
Right, yes.
Because they had to report it to the authorities. And
sure.
In an individual case, it's very hard to tell, right? And you only notice that there's a huge cover-up going on when you look at the statistics and look at them in space. Because when you add it up for all of Japan, the rate is only 7%, and so you say, well, maybe health conditions like syphilis drove it up. But when you see that there are these sort of clusters where almost every second child is claimed to be stillborn, you notice that something funny is going on. Now, this is still very much the situation around 1900. But then in the 1920s, the stillbirth rates begin to fall rapidly, and so our estimates for the number of infanticides really go down from, depending on where you see the balance between late-term abortions and infanticides, tens of thousands or more than 100,000 at the beginning of the 20th century, to just a couple of thousand in the late 30s. And then because of the Great East Asia and then Pacific War, there's another break in the statistics, and we don't really know what's going on during the war, because the statistics just aren't there. After the war, I found sort of one report of a woman remembering her life that mentions an infanticide in 1945. But this would have been, a fairly exceptional occurrence, is my sense. And then in 1948, 1949, abortion is effectively legalized in Japan.
I see. And
you get this huge surge in abortion. There are somewhere between 1 million and 3 million abortions, depending on how many you think were really reported by the mid-1950s. And abortion, for this brief moment in time, becomes the main way that Japanese couples plan their families, and then contraceptive practice slowly, gradually takes over. But once safe abortion is available, there's just no more need to commit infanticide. And also, the fact that the rates already declined so much in the 1920s suggests that there's something very incongruous about living in a world of electricity and being a citizen of a civilizing empire that has so much civilization that it can share it with the less fortunate parts of Asia, whether they want it or not, on the one hand, and committing infanticide on the other hand. So there might also be a generational story that in the 1920s, the women who are in their 40s and have their last children, they might still think infanticide is culturally acceptable, but their daughters, who have usually had a primary school education at least, and who are much more part of this new world, do not see it this way. There are a lot of open questions for me, especially in this 20th century part. I hope somebody else will pick it up in the years ahead and look more deeply into this. But at present, that's my best guess of the dynamics that lead to the terminal retreat of infanticide from Japan.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Oh, I enjoyed it, as you can tell. Thank you very much.
For more information about Professor Drixler and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.